In the year 1895, a small group of 35 began meeting in the home of Mac Jones on West South Orange Street in the town of South Orange, New Jersey. They were known as the Little Prayer Band and gathered to pray to God.
First Baptist Church has been monumental in the development and growth of South Orange and the town. We have grown with the town. We have stood through the test of change and innovation that's going on in the town. It was originally, established from a prayer group, a group of people who had come together, African Americans who were only allowed to worship and to live on 2 blocks.
The prayer group was organized by Cato Dishman and attended by Hannibal Kenny, Martha Jackson, J.M. McJones, Henrietta Randolph, Dennis Ford, and Sarah Bynum. Sermons led by Reverend Sidney Smith were later held in the South Orange Republicans Club. The name First Baptist Church of South Orange was suggested by founding member Sarah Bynum.
I think there has been the continuation of First Baptist as a presence, in South Orange. If you can think of South Orange back in the 1900s, it was the village of South Orange. I grew up with the pride that First Baptist was the only black institution, but it was a meaningful institution here.
Under the guidance of Reverend Smith, fundraising campaigns began to raise money for a church.
First Baptist Church was the only black institution that you had, in South Orange. And so this was a major hub. In that time, you had a lot of quote-unquote domestics who would come here and work in the various homes, and so they congregated here at the church and grew the church.
The Reverend Sidney W. Smith, pastor of the Baptist Church, is making a strong effort to secure money with which to buy a lot for the purpose of having a church erected. The concert given on October 25th netted $52.50, and the congregation wishes to thank all those who assisted.
As time called for Reverend Smith to leave the congregation, the position was filled by the prestigious Reverend G.W. Long.
The Reverend G.W. Long A.M. has formally accepted a call as pastor of the First Baptist Church.
Reverend Long was a well-educated man who, at age 14, entered college and graduated from Howard University at 19 with an associate's medical degree. Devoted to education, Reverend Long was a member of the South Orange Board of Education and worked with the local community to encourage learning in the school districts, much like his predecessor, Reverend Smith, had done. Both believed in the power a full education held, which inspired Reverend Long's address to the community titled Education. In 1899, under Reverend Albert Edward, the church became officially recognized and set out to find a permanent home.
I think it just parallels the civil rights movement. So I know, again, as a young child, now I'm telling my age, but as a young child, I remember the church being a place for the Southern Leadership Conference, and they were very intimately involved with Dr. King in the civil rights movement. And so a lot of that experience came through here.
Entering the 20th century, First Baptists struggled to find their permanent home and experienced spiritual guidance from a great many leaders, such as Reverend Spurnell and Tunstall. In 1906, Reverend John Bolden was appointed as pastor and continued the effort to fund the building of a church. The church, now gathering in a home on First Street, was blessed on July 13, 1908, when Mr. and Mrs. John Morgan deeded the property of 103 Valley Street to First Baptist for a sum of $1. The church still faced the challenge of constructing a proper edifice. Construction of the church began on November 14, 1909.
The cornerstone of the First Baptist Church at 2nd and Valley Street, South Orange, was laid yesterday afternoon. Mr. Mitchell also laid the stone. He was assisted by the Reverend John D. Bolden, pastor of the church, who pronounced the benediction.
Despite struggles in the building process and limited funds, the church worked hard until 1912, when the building was completed with assistance from friends at the South Orange Methodist Church. In the year 1913, the church was led by Reverend James Crosby, and on November 24th, 1913, the church announced their mortgage had been lifted by a combined effort of Reverend James Crosby and Mr. Kinsey, a white friend and member of the South Orange Methodist Church. With their new home complete, First Baptist Church of South Orange was able to begin growing both in size and in the community. During the early years of the church, founding sister Sarah Bynum worked to instill principles in the church. She ensured the church would believe in good government, sound educational endeavors, and positive community relations. Sarah Bynum also founded the Orange Blossom Juvenile Lodge 17 to work with children in the community. The Orange Blossoms successfully raised money to fill the church with pews. From 1928 to 1931, the church was led by Reverend John Askew. Reverend Askew was replaced by Reverend John Ellison, who promoted education in the community in correlation with the newly built Columbia High School before leaving First Baptist to become the first African-American president at the University of Virginia. The role of pastor was filled in 1934 by Reverend George Gunther, who became a professor at Lynchburg University after serving years at First Baptist for nearly 10 years. In 1943, Reverend John Wesley Nance was appointed. Reverend Nance led the church and made the decision to purchase a parsonage at 152 Academy Street. Reverend Nance served for 2 years before the church welcomed Reverend Leon Sullivan in 1945.
Leon Sullivan, he was assistant pastor at Abyssinian Baptist Church, a famous church in New York, under the leadership of Adam Clayton Powell, who was one of the more dynamic black congressmen in the 20th century. Then Dr. Sullivan was a pastor at First Baptist Church in South Orange, New Jersey. And then he went to Philadelphia, which he was most known for, at Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia, where he led that church for almost 40 years. And then he founded the Opportunities Industrialization Centers, which trained people for employment. He started the Sullivan Principles for organizations who did business in South Africa.
I admired his mind. Leon saw, he was such a visionary. He saw what other people just could not see. Leon saw what the presidents couldn't see, leaders of nations couldn't see. He saw a bridge. He saw what could be. He met every president since Lyndon Johnson up until his death.
He worked with Mayor LaGuardia to get more black policemen on the street. Particularly for that time, for him to have the ability to sit down with Mayor LaGuardia and discuss the presence of black people on the police force, or lack thereof, and for them to be able to work together and really come to an agreement on getting some black policemen hired. I think that's an important piece that even today is missing, because you still see in a lot of big cities, people are still complaining about the lack of black representation in the police force. And I think somebody of Reverend Leon's stature to be able to serve as a bridge between the mayor and the police force and the community is very important.
He saw people in their socioeconomic condition and saw what could become as an organizer, as a man who stood for justice and equity of all people. And his ability to see that and then to organize people together to make that happen impressed me so much. I wish I had more time with him.
History was made in New Jersey last week when Reverend Leon H. Sullivan, pastor of the First Baptist Church of South Orange, was unanimously elected to the presidency of the South Orange Council of Churches, the first time a Negro has been elevated to that position. Matters pertaining to the spiritual welfare of some 15,000 church communicants are directed by this organization. 14,000 are white.
He saw stuff even here for First Baptist in South Orange that others couldn't see. He was really before his time here in South Orange. The church couldn't grasp his vision because it was such an enormous vision for this church, this community, and ultimately the country and the world. But not only could not the church embrace his vision, South Orange as a whole couldn't embrace his vision at that time. And so Leon ended up moving on to carry out his vision, and the rest is history. He literally carried it out around the world.
Reverend Sullivan left First Baptist in 1950 for Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Reverend Sullivan continued to fight for equality and increase African American business and wealth. He helped found Progress Plaza, the first shopping plaza owned and operated by African Americans. He worked to decrease unemployment and poverty through his programs and initiatives. Sullivan became a leader of the civil rights movement, working with Martin Luther King Jr. on many protests.
It tells me the story about the customers of Tasty Cake, particularly people of color, would apply for jobs at Tasty Cake but wouldn't get the jobs. They wouldn't get hired. Leon, being who he is, organized and said to Tasty Cake, listen, we are your #1 customer, but you won't hire us. And they refused to hire him, so he led a boycott. And that led to Tasty Cake hiring its first people of color. Somehow along the way at that time, something was happening in Montgomery. And Leon tells the story about how a young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Andrew Young, the first African-American mayor of Atlanta, was contemplating how they're going to deal with this issue with this woman by the name of Rosa Parks. They say they look down and see this paper entitled Tasty Cake Hires Its First Blacks. They find out it's Leon Sullivan, calls him up, have a phone conversation with him, and by the time they hang up the phone, they have the plan for the Montgomery bus boycott. And he was just that kind of a person, mover and shaker.
Leon Sullivan became the first black man to sit on the board of a Fortune 500 company when he became a board member for General Motors. While sitting at General Motors, he developed the Sullivan Principles, which allowed businesses to draw from business relations with South Africa and helped end the apartheid.
During the time of the 1970s, there were a lot of protests about South Africa and the treatment of black people in South Africa. And he developed some principles for companies to divest from South Africa. By that time, he was already on the board of General Motors, and so he had a lot of weight with corporations. And so there was a big movement for companies who were in South Africa to divest and not invest in the country because of apartheid. And his Sullivan Principles were very important in leading that divestment movement. And he became an international figure, particularly when it comes to Africa. So the work he was doing in Philadelphia, he internationalized in terms of training people, getting people prepared for the workforce, but also this whole idea of social justice.
Later in his life, Reverend Sullivan founded IFESH, the International Foundation for Education and Self-Help, to help stimulate the small businesses of Africa, a cause Sullivan continued to in his final years. Reverend Sullivan passed away in 2001, a civil rights legend who began at First Baptist Church of South Orange. After Reverend Sullivan left, Reverend Edgar G. Thomas was appointed as pastor in 1951. Reverend Thomas worked to better the church, the community, and the nation. Within the church, Reverend Thomas created and adapted a constitution, adopted a financial reporting system, formed a board of trustees, and created a unified treasury. It was Reverend Thomas who urged members of the parish to donate the ornate stained glass windows seen throughout the church.
Edgar Thomas, by far, is the pastor that has the longest tenure, and I believe that is 30 years. And he was active, what I understand also. He was definitely engaged in civil rights. He was engaged in, of course, justice. My understanding, at some point, he went to Morehouse and roomed with Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a roommate of Dr. Martin Luther King, at least for one semester.
Nationally, Reverend Thomas served with Martin Luther King as a board member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, one of the pioneering groups of the civil rights movement. It was here in the South Orange community where Reverend Thomas had the greatest effect. He was president of the South Orange Maplewood NAACP Committee, vice president of the Citizens Party League of South Orange, board member on both the American Civil Liberties Union and the Essex County Urban League, and as a member of the South Orange Council of Churches. Edgar R. Thomas was a very busy man, but never too busy for his parish, and led First Baptist Church of South Orange for 33 years.
Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a letter to First Baptist, and his wife, Coretta Scott King, sent Christmas cards to us. So my understanding is that was done because of the active civil action of an activity, as well as being the roommate of Dr. King by Dr. Edgar Thomas.
During the 1960s, the Reverend worked within the community to further civil equality as a pioneering voice of the open housing movement in South Orange. Mirroring the fair housing movement happening at the national level, the open housing movement sought to further integrate the community. Before action was taken, African American families were permitted to live on 1st, 2nd, 3rd, Valley, and Church Street, preventing integration of the neighborhoods. The open housing movement was led by the Fair Housing Council. Reverend Thomas served as the only member of color.
Well, I believe that people should have the right to live wherever they can afford to live. And at that time, they were not allowed to do that. In fact, when I came here, there were no black people living above Ridgewood Road. But Reverend Thomas was here at the time, and a man from the Fair Housing in Netley came over and said to us, why don't you start a fair housing? And it lasted about 20 years.
In order to hold realtors accountable for racial bias, the community would send a black family and a white family with similar credentials to apply for the same house. If realtors chose the white family over the black family, the council now had evidence to pursue a case of injustice.
Again, you had people like my parents, John and Lula Slackman, who started in the Fair Housing and worked with the Fair Housing Association, so there were efforts. As a child, I had an idyllic upbringing here in South Orange. I didn't know that we were relegated, to a certain town. In those days, for a black family to be able to buy a nice-sized house and to live there, that was just what we knew. This was the community we lived in, etc. And you had blacks who were living, on Roland Avenue, Academy Street, later on up South Orange Avenue, etc. But I guess all of that grew out of the effort of the Fair Housing to open up that, to allow that. Part of the process, I remember my father and his friends and my Aunt Dottie, they would go and pretend to buy a house above South Orange Avenue, would be denied, and then their white counterparts would go because they were testing the water there. But again, we began seeing a change, particularly in the 70s, as a lot of things began to open up. This was post the Civil Rights Act, post the Voting Rights Act, etc. So a lot of things, I think, just began opening up. And I think a major component of that was the Brown versus Board of Ed, where schools were forced to be desegregated.
Although we're in a situation where we're landlocked when it comes to expanding the building here in South Orange, and where, as the first church of color, the people of color were only allowed to live on 2nd Street, no further above at one point, the town has now grown around First Baptist Church. There's little land, if any, to buy up at all in a growing ministry. Hence, I keep adding services because we're still growing.
Reverend Thomas and First Baptist Church of South Orange also partook in South Orange's Good Neighbor Weekend. The weekend consisted of the town's churches and their preachers educating the town of property appreciation and falsehood myths of integrated communities. First Baptist stayed true to Bynum's ideologies by educating the community, working with the local government to further change, and increasing community involvement and integration.
So then a law in New Jersey passed that said that discrimination is against the law.
The Fair Housing Council disbanded in the final years of the 60s, But from the remnants, the Civic Association was founded.
So after we had felt that we had done stabilized that part of the community, then the people, a lot of them went down to Newark and started South Orange Civic Association.
The Civic Association saw many church members help throughout their mission to encourage greater integration. The Civic Association found great success after the Newark riots in aiding victims of the riot and integrating local towns and cities around South Orange.
You had leaders such as, my father, my mother, and others who started the South Orange Civic Association. Dorothy Pounds, she was also one of the founding members of the South Orange Civic Association, and that grew out of, again, a collaboration between Jews and whites who were taking a look at the fair housing issues, here in South Orange, being able to live wherever you wanted to live if you could afford to live there without being relegated to a certain area. From that joint collaboration, you had the South Orange Civic Association form. Fast forward to even the 1970s, members of the South Orange Civic Association here then morphed into SOMAC.
In 1974, along with Reverend Thomas, the Slatmans, the Macmillans, and the Allens, we started an organization called SOMAC, which was South Orange Maplewood Awareness Council, where we would try to help Reverend Thomas at the time, who was the pastor here, get elected on the Board of Education. And also this organization was for to stop realtors at that particular time bringing clients into South Orange, but gearing them to a special area in South Orange to live. Like here, Academy Street, 2nd Street. And we started this organization to stop that.
Reverend Thomas became such a figurehead in the South Orange community. The town declared a Reverend Thomas Week in 1981, and they later awarded Reverend Thomas the Villager of the Month Award in 1984. Sadly, Reverend Thomas passed away in March of 1984, but will always be remembered by the church library dedicated in his memory.
But we felt that we needed something where we would be responsible for. But it's not needed now as it was in 1944.
In wake of Reverend Thomas's passing, the church was led by Reverend Earl Middleton and Deacon Neville Kidd until the arrival of Reverend D. Christ Northington. Reverend Northington led the church during the prosperous time and maintained the importance of community. He was one of the pastors involved with South Orange Remembrance Ceremony after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Reverend Northington focused on the betterment of the church as pastor. He refurbished many parts of the church, purchased new Bibles, developed a disposable communion ceremony, and installed an air conditioning unit and sound system. Reverend Northington ended his career at First Baptist in 1991, and the church struggled to find a lasting leader.
Now, First Baptist had many pastors, more than most churches and religious organizations.
From 1991 to 1997, the church was led by several different pastors, including Reverend Earl Middleton and Reverend James Mantle. Amidst the challenging leadership, First Baptist struggled to grow as a parish. The church found its next great leader in 1997, when Reverend Terry Richardson became the pastor.
When Pastor Richardson got here, he transformed the church from someone who's, let's say, 30-ish to where it is now. When I look back, one of the memories I have is for someone who was that young to be able to come into an environment and to change it and to open it up spiritually. I think that's really something that stands out to me, and I think it's really a big accomplishment.
One thing I explained to the church when I received this sense of vision: First Baptist Church was never meant to only stay or effect this corner alone, the corner of Valley and 2nd Street. It was never meant to just remain on the Valley, on this corner. Even if the physical building was here or not, It was meant to influence and have impact in this township, in this state, in this country, and around the world. Once I understood the vision given me, I realized it's not much different from the vision that God had given Leon Sullivan. It still is a worldwide vision in terms of the impact that God and determines that this church will have on the world. So I've been, for the past 24 years, doing what I can do to help articulate that vision to the church, to articulate its future.
So people got everything from the black church. I mean, they got education from the black church. You learned history at the black church. If your family was having a hard time, the church supported you. There really was a close-knit community. Children were mentored by the black church. The black church has always served as a safe haven for the community.
African Americans needed a safe place, not only to worship, but to have hard conversations about some of the struggles that were going on, emotionally and physically, spiritually. Some of the things that were going on politically, they needed a place. So it became the place where children were able to come and get help and support after school. They were able to learn how to read. It became a safe place for parents in order to come, for seniors to be able to come. We actually established the first brownies group in the area. So we had that also here at First Baptist Church, and the young people were able to do that. So it was just a part of the community the entire time, and it just grew more and more. It made an imprint on the lives of many people that were in the area.
As a youngster, you don't have any responsibilities. You go to church because mom and dad still go to church, but you don't take on any responsibilities in the church. But as you get older, if it's meant for you to be, then you start doing things with the church. Everybody should have a church home, though. Yes, and it has to be a place that you like, and a place that develops your character. That's the main thing that God wants you to do, is develop character.
As someone who's been here 5 generations, who grew up in this church, this was the place where I came for Sunday school, and of course we were related to everybody. My great aunt was the Sunday school superintendent for 35 years. Her husband was the Sunday school secretary. My mother was a teacher here, and then later on when I came back to the area, my husband taught Sunday school here. So it's always been a mainstay in my family and my upbringing. It's one of those things that I don't know life without knowing of First Baptist. And whether I was physically in South Orange or whether I was living in Boston or Kansas or New Orleans, First Baptist was always rooted within me. It was always my point of reference for religious foundation, for spiritual comfort, etc., because of the fun that we had here.
Explosive growth. It was very challenging. The growth itself was very challenging because it started happening out of nowhere all at once. We were bringing in more people than the seating capacity had for the worshipers. There were some people, I should say, that was nervous, didn't want the growth and the development. But I just remember the explosive growth that second 10 years and really the need to begin to truly speak to culture for where we were going, not where we were or where we came from.
My father has just been involved in the community. He wants to have this legacy where he's just impacting people internationally, which is something he has done. He's gone to Africa to build houses and build school for people. He's here in our community as well. We've done breast cancer walks. We've done Black awareness walks as well, where it's mostly just youth, and he was communicating with that specific organization, and he was just walking with us at the same time.
There is a scripture in 1 John that says that the world will know by how we love that we belong to God, for God is love. And I think there are many times when we look at churches and we look at their history and we look at their pitfalls, but there is one awesome thing that we do at this church, and that's we love well. And so if we love well and everyone around us knows that we are a house of love and prayer, then they'll know we belong to Him.
But after Pastor Richardson came, things started to change, because my husband, he's been in the church so long, for 69 years, he was like amazed to see what was going on in the church. And I was glad that the change was happening because of my children, in the church. I'm just proud to say that I'm a member of First Baptist Church, and I like what's going on, and that the changes that has happening over the years continue to happen.
That something is right about this church, for it to last this long and for things to be going on so long. There's something unique, dynamic about this place. It means a lot. It means commitment, love, everything.
Here's what I realized. God didn't give me a new vision. The vision is the same that goes back to that prayer band that started in 1894. That was the vision for this church, to impact the world for Christ and to touch lives and help people become the best that they can become as they see themselves through God's lens and not the lens that people see them through, or even that they see themselves. And I know that's my job while I'm here. I know that was Leon's job. I know that Edgar Thomas did the same thing. So I'm one of the fortunate ones to have been called to help further that vision and help people realize that not just this congregation, not just this township, but the world. So its future, it's really beyond the borders of this place.